very much, Susan. Good. Well, as the director and indeed the initiator of the Insiders Outsiders project, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you today and to hand over very shortly to Anita Peleg, who I've had the pleasure of knowing personally for quite some years, Anita, isn't it now? And I did also, I'll add on a very personal note, I did have the privilege and the pleasure of meeting Naomi herself, but at the end of her life, and I could still sense a tremendous kind of strong humanity kind of emanating from her, even though she wasn't exactly in the best physical and indeed mental state. But I will always remember her very, very fondly, Anita. I will say that from the very, very start. Okay, fine. So you know the technical ropes. Let me just say a few words about Anita herself before handing over to her. She's a very experienced university lecturer and national teaching fellow, specializing in business ethics. She's also, in her kind of second life, as it were, sort of alternative life, she's carried out significant research into the Holocaust and indeed published 2 books about her mother, the sculptor and Holocaust survivor, Naomi Blake. Most recently, she has become the chair of a wonderful new project, which I'm sure you would like to quiz her about. Perhaps she herself will tell us something at the end, called Generation to Generation. I'm curious to know how many of you have already come across it. Essentially, it's a recently established charity that enables and indeed helps train, helps encourage descendants of Holocaust survivors and refugees to tell their stories, in a sense, on behalf of their parents, grandparents, whatever. She's also a trustee of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. And in all these roles, she's been able to apply very effectively, and as you'll see, she's a wonderful communicator, to apply her 20 years of teaching experience to educate as wide a public as possible about the Holocaust, speaking at universities, schools, Jewish and Christian religious institutions. And I should perhaps just add something that I should have said at the beginning, that as you may be aware, the Insiders Outsiders project has, for the most part, and for really purely historical reasons, focused on the immense contribution to British culture made by those who came in time, as my parents always used to say. Yes, those who came as refugees from Nazism before the outbreak of the Second World War. And of course, inevitably, sadly, tragically, much smaller in number are those like Naomi who went through the worst and came out and settled in this country later. So she is one of a minority in those terms, but the Insiders Outsiders project certainly embraces the Holocaust survivors as well. It goes without saying. Very good. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me a moment. Okay, I'm hoping that
yes, that's
you can
fine.
see my screen. Just to say that everything I tell you here, I tell you in terms of my mother's story from what she told me. And as much as possible, I am also going to include her voice, which was recorded, I believe, by the Imperial War Museum and is now archived in the British Library. So with that, I will start. Sorry, one moment. Just okay.
When one asked me, what did you think when you made this piece, I can only think of one thing: whether it's time to fetch my children, whether I have enough bread or butter. It's very subconscious, this work. It comes, whatever I do, Auschwitz, I will carry in almost everything, including cooking probably. I don't think it ever leaves. Not so much my own experience. It's like an operation, that you go through some pain. It's the people that didn't survive that is on your mind constantly. And I never think of what I had, the cold or the hunger that I went through. It's constantly the people. My father, I couldn't save. The 9 grandchildren that my parents had, I didn't lift my little finger to save them. It's always on my mind. Everything that comes out, let it be abstract or figurative, it is subconsciously motivated by my past, I'm sure.
In 1952, Naomi Blake, née Zisi Dum, arrived in London to start a new life. She was brought up in a religious home in Mukachevo, Czechoslovakia, She survived Auschwitz and the death marches. And she had recreated her life in Israel and was now about to start again. She had left behind her dearest and closest friends in Israel, and the remaining family members that had survived concentration camp were scattered across the world in, sorry, my slides are not moving. Again, I'm having a problem with my slides and I don't know why. So you'll have to forgive me a moment. Okay.
Just okay.
This happens. So as I was saying, she had left family members who had survived Auschwitz and other camps across the world, in Australia, Venezuela, Tangier, Belgium, and the US. And together with that, she constantly faced the memory. Again, my slides are not moving.
Maybe exit, Anita, and start again. It sometimes gets stuck, doesn't it?
It's very strange. Okay, no, I got it moving there. I don't quite understand what's going on, but hopefully it will be okay. Apologies. So together with that, she constantly faced the memory of her ordeal in concentration camp and the loss of her home in Mukachevo and 17 family members. When she arrived in London, she didn't know the language or the culture. She knew one person, Asher Blake, and had decided to try a life with him. She found the British Jews rather cold and not interested in her story, or at least that's how she perceived it. And so she made friends mainly with fellow refugees and non-Jews. Her difficulty with language made her look for another outlet. And in 1955, after my brother John was born, she signed up to sculpture classes at the Hornsey School of Art. Here she was reminded of an experience where she also felt isolated, when she was injured in the Israeli War of Independence by shrapnel from a British bullet and taken to the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. Due to her injury, she was unable to speak, and following an attack on the road, the hospital was cut off and she received no visitors. Soon, however, she found a pastime. A soldier friend who was stationed right nearby gave her a knife, a piece of olive wood, and she carved her first sculpture, a dog. I wish I could show you that sculpture, but I don't have it. Over the next few years, she experimented with ceramics and portrait sculpture from clay and developed her skill. And she discovered that she did have an ability, but creating beautiful ceramics and portraits was not enough for her. She wanted to use her talents to express her experiences of the Holocaust, and she found portrait sculpture rather restrictive. And so she started to experiment with abstract and semi-figurative work, which you see here. I think in this photo, the most striking thing is probably her hairdo, which is certainly a sign of the times of the 60s. And here again, this is her garden, and you can see her with her lifelong friend Doreen, also a sculptor, and you can see those first abstract sculptures that she developed. This sculpture here is called View in Fitzroy Square. Again, experimenting in those early days with abstract work. And then she moved to semi-figurative work, like in this sculpture here called Image. Slowly building in a figure. She then moved from working with clay and started working in polystyrene. And as she's going to tell you, she was able to give polystyrene life and express subconsciously her past and her hopes for the future.
It's called polystyrene. Polystyrene.
And how do you buy it? In blocks?
Blocks, huge blocks, 8 foot by 4 foot by 2 foot. They come and you carve out your shapes. So he really introduced me to it. At first I couldn't get to grips with it. It's a cold plastic material. You take a piece of clay, you drop it and you pick it up and there is a form. You can develop a form from it. This is cold, you have to give it life. It has no life of its own. But I did get through to it somehow. Now I love it. Now I can express my feelings with it. And I can do big pieces. I feel so strong. A 9 foot big piece of sculpture I can carry on my own. And I can put it upside down and work really on it.
And a lot of her forms she developed from unconscious doodles, such as these on the wall of her studio. And as she worked, the meaning developed, and only at the end, when it was finished and cast, would she name the sculpture. In fact, she told me that names meant very little to her. She wanted her audience to look for meaning, and she did not want her work to be confined by a particular interpretation or by a name. And so while she did recount her story to me in great detail, starting at the age of 9, and later in interviews for a book, she never explained her sculpture. I remember when she took me to exhibitions, rather than explain the symbolism of the abstract works that we were looking at, she would always tell me the background and story of the sculptor to help me find my own interpretation. So in the spirit of this, I will tell you her story as she told it to me. She told it to me. Sorry, when there's a delay, it's because I'm having a problem moving the slides. I will later, when we look at more of her sculpture in detail, I'll refer to themes that I've interpreted from her work, but as she would not want me to dictate, I'll leave you to draw your own ideas as well. This book here is called Glimmer of Hope. I wrote this in 2014. I can't say I wrote it that year, but it was produced that year. It was many years of work directly from interviews that I had with her. And it demonstrates one very important part of her character, her determination, in particular her determination to survive, which is summarized by her words.
From the very beginning, I had a feeling that I will survive in the camp and in the wagon, and already in the brick factory in the wagon, I kept on seeing a light coming towards me from the far distance, but coming nearer and nearer. And this light kept on occurring again and again at night, during the day, from very far distance, but it seems to come nearer. And the same light was very near to me when I reached Haifa in this illegal boat. Yes. It never left me, and then it left me. It's a funny occurrence. I never forget this. a kind of a torchlight, very far first, very much coming nearer and nearer. And yeah, this light always was with me.
So let me tell you her story, the story that she asked me to write and to tell. Her key motivation was to preserve memory, the memory of her family and the 6 million Jews who'd been murdered. She wanted me to express her ordeal from 1938, when at the age of 14, her happy childhood came to an end, when the German-backed Hungarian regime took over the democratic Czech-controlled town of Mukachevo. The white dot is Mukachevo. The dotted line is the area that kept on changing hands. So when my mother was born in 1924, it was part of Czechoslovakia. Prior to the First World War, it was part of Hungary. And then in 1938, it became part of Hungary again. She was born the youngest of 10 children to an Orthodox Jewish family. You can see here the only 2 surviving photos of her family, my family. The man with the wonderful white beard, her grandfather, was the head of the rabbinical courts in Mukachevo. His name was David Schlissel. And the woman on her, in the photo on the right, is her mother, my grandmother, Chaya Edel. So, a happy childhood. She attended a mixed school, had Jewish and non-Jewish friends, played freely on the streets with her neighbors. And then she told me how the change of regime with a new teacher, a Hungarian teacher, where everything suddenly changed. And she remembers looking out over the town square from her classroom and the new Hungarian teacher standing over her shoulder, pointing at her parents' fabric store and saying, now we don't need to worry anymore. We won't have these Jews looking over our shoulder. And then how her friend Trudy was no longer allowed to sit next to her. And her friend Kurt no longer carried her books home. And then how the Jews were forced to wear a yellow star, prevented from going to school, owning businesses, going out after dark, where they were beaten on the streets and friends and neighbors suddenly turned against them.
When I think of it, how that we lived so happily and peacefully with our neighbors, and they towards us as well, with a concern, and yet when it came to it, there was nobody. All the doors were shut, all the windows tightly shut, nobody came out, afraid, and in no time they could change their attitude from friendliness to hatred. I suppose to justify their feelings, or that they can't help us, then serves them right because they are Jews. That's a frightening thing. One feels one has nice neighbors, reliable neighbors, and they can turn in no time. Yes. But not that I accuse them, yes, I can understand it. But I may have acted the same way. Who knows if I have children and I want to protect them. But still, it's a frightening thought.
And then she told me how just after Pesach in 1944, when 3 weeks earlier the German armies had taken over in Hungary, how they were forced to pack their belongings and move to the other side of town, to the ghetto. And there, all they had was the food they brought with them, and they waited. 2 weeks later, she described how they were lined up in rows of 5 and marched out of the brick factory. Sorry, out of the ghetto to the brick factory. And she described to me how the soldiers would beat them, urging them to run faster and faster, and how she put out her arms to protect her father and her nephew from those blows. She described not only that terrible march, but how they were forced to sleep out at night on the ground at the brick factory, waiting. And as they waited, they heard the cries of people from trains as they pulled into the station, calling out for water, for help. But there was nothing they could do. And then how they were literally herded onto trains and squeezed into cattle trucks, forced to stand for 3 days as the train moved very, very slowly, no room to breathe. And how during that terrible journey, after a day of the train starting and stopping and starting and stopping, she felt she couldn't bear the screams of the children and the calls for help from the adults. And she closed her eyes. And at that moment, when she closed her eyes, she conjured up a little star, a twinkling star, she called it. That little star became her glimmer of hope. So that when things got bad, and they did get worse, she would summon up that little light when she closed her eyes, and it kept her going. And so they continued on that journey for 3 days until they arrived at their destination.
And suddenly the doors opened, and it was heaven. Suddenly fresh air. It didn't last long, within split seconds. Screaming, heroes, heroes, bald-headed man jumping onto the wagon and pushing us brutally out, speaking Yiddish, striped uniform, and often they came quietly and told us to take care, don't cry too much, tell that your son is 15, 16, not 12. They kept on giving us advice what to do and how to save ourselves. They were called capos, or maybe they weren't capos. But I hear such a lot of condemning those people who were already 3 or 4 years in Auschwitz. They did their best to advise us, but in order to survive, they had to show to the Germans that they are really brutal. Only those could survive that showed brutality to their own fellow. And so they started pushing us out through the door, and our luggage thrown out after us. As soon as we stepped out, we were so bewildered again. We just wanted the family to be together, and we kept on screaming each other's name. And other people did the same, so there was a lot of screaming. As we walked, as we were pushed to walk, we were ordered to form 5 in a line, in a row. I saw lying on the ground a lot of men, and they kept on repeating, if you ever survive, tell the story, what they did to us, tell them. People lying on the ground, blood oozing from them. In no time we were ordered men and boys separate, women and children separate, and then I saw my father and Fishy going to his best friend Naomi Blake was his name, a wonderful man, going on one side, and I waved to them, and we all said, "Be seeing you, be seeing you." And then the same happened to my sister Gizzy and her 3 children. She went to they separated us, mothers and children. And she too said, "Be seeing you, we will probably get together on the other side somehow." We all hoped. That was the last I saw of my father, and Fifi, and Gizzy, and her Judithko, Miriam, and Eva.
So there she was with her sister Malchi, and they were marched into the camp, heads shaven, frightened for a moment when they called out each other's names and couldn't recognize each other. But at least they were together. And they were marched to this barrack, or at least a similar barrack. And it was there that they asked people. They asked people about the terrible smell, not wanting to believe what they were told. But she wanted people to know about those terrible months in Auschwitz and Stutthof and then Branau concentration camps, where she and her sister and the other women were forced to work sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day on very little food, watching their friends die around them. And how the camp guards would play tricks on them by making them stand in the hot sun, giving them stale bread so that their stomachs would turn. Then they'd close the toilets. And if anyone soiled themselves, they were beaten. But despite this terrible suffering, she also described with great pride how her fellow inmates found ways to disable the bombs that they were tasked to build, taught by other prisoners of war in the munitions factory that they were sent to. And she also told me, with some humor and pride, of the determination of the women she worked with to survive. What did they talk about? They talked about food. They argued about who made the best cheesecake, whose chicken soup was the best. But most of all, they promised each other that when they survived, not if they survived, but when they survived, they would always carry a loaf of bread with them. And then she told me how in February 1945, the German soldiers marched their prisoners towards the Baltic Sea to escape the advancing Russian armies with the aim of drowning their prisoners and destroying the evidence. There was snow on the ground. They didn't have coats. They were freezing cold. But if they didn't continue, they would be shot. And it was at one moment where my mother again almost gave up hope. But she closed her eyes and she saw that little star, that little light. And at that moment, she knew that they needed to get away from their captors. And she and her sister and some other women managed to run away into the woods and finally escape. She then embarked on a long route home. It wasn't easy. On foot, jumping on trucks, trains, but also trying to avoid the victorious Russian soldiers who only had 2 things on their mind: women and alcohol. And then, of course, the reality of returning home to find that 18 out of 26 of her family members, including 10 children, her nephews and nieces, had been murdered and her home and possessions destroyed.
While we were in Auschwitz, we didn't know what happened to others, of course. We heard about the gas chamber but we wouldn't take it in. We saw the chimney and we smelled. The smell was always horrible, or flesh smell. But we didn't want to take it in. And then we started realizing really that it's true. And it so happens that one feels guilty. It's not a pleasant thing to survive other people, especially children. The town was, you didn't see a Jew. It used to be full of bearded Jews and lots of children humming, playing, screaming, crying. Nothing in the street, only a few non-Jewish children. They kept very quiet. They felt uncomfortable. And whenever walking the streets, we remembered our, especially the children. Then we already knew that the children didn't survive at all. So we always ended up crying on each shoulder whenever we happened to be together.
And it was her need to create a positive alternative that meant that she, in the night, left a note for those brothers and sisters that she had recently been reunited with. And she left and she travelled with a group of people across Europe, boarded this boat, the Enso Sereni, in Italy, to get to Palestine, where she was involved in the creation of the State of Israel and her first attempt at the sculpture, as I told you earlier. And so we're back full circle to her life as a sculptor in London. And we can look more closely at some of the themes that I've interpreted from her sculpture and see what you see as well. Throughout her story, she talks about the loss of her family and the loss of the children. She wanted her sculpture to give testimony. She wanted this memory to have a purpose. So memory was a major theme, and we see it in these sculptures here that are in churches, synagogues, peace parks. For example, this work, Sanctuary, at the bottom, is at St. Botholt's Church in the City of London. The sculpture on the right, Refugee, is at a peace park in Nottingham. So she wanted her memory to have a purpose. She believed that survival was only worthwhile if you helped others. And so she wanted her sculpture to promote understanding between faiths and a more hopeful future. And that's a second theme, as you see here, in a sculpture called Genesis, that is at the St. Catherine's Foundation, also in the city. Finally, she was always positive. She saw the good in people. Perhaps that explains her hope, her glimmer of hope that always helped her, and her optimism for the future, which we can see in these were her two last sculptures, the one on the left called Towards Tomorrow, and the one on the right, as you know from the cover of my book, Glimmer of Hope. As I mentioned earlier, in the work you'll see now, you'll see how through these themes she abandoned portrait sculpture and experimented with abstract forms, just like other artists of the day, such as Hepworth, who she greatly admired, Henry Moore and others. So as I said, her early memorial work was very important, and it continued throughout her life. The early work took on an abstract form, and there's often a symbol of 6 or a branch, like you see here in her sculpture at Leeds Synagogue, which is dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust. And this sculpture here, which today is at Beth Shalom, the National Holocaust Centre, and also at Muswell Hill Synagogue. So sometimes in these abstract forms, you see the symbol of 6, the shape of a menorah or 6 branches, barbed wire, or Hebrew words of remembrance, like the sculpture on the left, which is at the London Centre of Jewish Studies, I think it's called, and in Hendon, and on the right at the Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue. In 1973, she was introduced to the Council for Christians and Jews, and a piece of work was commissioned for them. I don't have a photo of that work, but it was very similar to the one on the right here, just a bit bigger. That was this one at the right that is currently at Hampstead Garden Suburb Synagogue. And from then on, her theme of memorial developed into a further theme that I mentioned before of promoting understanding between faiths. And that gave her work a purpose for the future. It was no longer just about the personal expression of her past, but she wanted through her sculpture to educate, to make people aware. And this was the start of a long-term relationship with various churches and cathedrals who also wanted to share her message. And alongside these very explicit symbols of memorial work, other symbols developed. So through abstract sculpture, embryonic forms or semi-figurative forms with a protective ring. So the sculpture on the right is called embryo, and the sculpture at the bottom here is called turning figure. And there you can see a figure, a crouching figure, protected. This theme of protection, I personally think, was very important, and it came home to me recently, even more so. So I want to just tell you about this sculpture here. This is called Memorial to the 6 Million. And I have to tell you, I feel rather embarrassed actually by the fact that this is one of the pieces that I remember for the longest. It was always in the house. It's one of the earliest pieces that she created. And what I saw in this sculpture, probably because I was young and I just didn't think, what I saw was 2 hands in supplication, trying to get help, confined by this barbed wire. And it was only recently when somebody came to the house and looked at it and saw something completely different, which is that actually it's not 2 hands of the same person. It's different hands. It's a large adult hand protecting a small, probably child's hand. And that suddenly brought home to me even more how important this theme of protection was. And we see it in those works that I showed you before with the protective ring, and in this work, Sanctuary, where there's a crouching figure, clearly in need of protection. But then as things developed, her figures became more upright, more positive, always dignified, as we see in this sculpture, which is actually my favorite. It's called Feminine Form. These 2 sculptures are part of a series of sculptures called Refugee. And they became an important cornerstone of her relationship with churches and cathedrals, as they are displayed not only in Bristol Cathedral, but in other places like the Peace Park in Nottingham and other places of worship. And this association with Bristol Cathedral in particular, together with her friend Yvonne Craig, was important because it started them both on a journey where they set up a series of sculpture shows for Amnesty International, firstly at Bristol Cathedral and then other venues, to raise awareness of the plight of refugees and human rights causes. And then in the 80s, something suddenly changed, and it brought in possibly another theme, a theme of freedom, of breaking free. And we see that in her series called Man Against the Odds, where you see two photos of a figure upright, battling against the odds, against the winds, possibly, and a series called Wings, or Winged Forms. And again, she's moved back a little bit. Maybe back isn't the right word, but she's moved again to a slightly more abstract work. And it was interesting that she was interviewed in an article in The Guardian, and she admitted, she was quoted as saying, "I want to break away from what I've done before. Maybe I'm free from the past now a little bit." And here you see another form of the series of Man Against the Odds and some of the sculptures in the Wings series. However, she always returned to the image of the human figure, always positive and dignified. And in an interview with The Guardian, with that same writer, she quite remarkably said, there's something positive in the human figure. There's a lot of good in people. And then she also said, with my past, if I were pessimistic, it wouldn't have been worthwhile surviving. And it's this later work that has clear images of family, perhaps representing the family that she lost in concentration camp, her parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, and 10 nephews and nieces, and possibly the new family that she created. All of these later human figures appear without a protective ring. Again, positive, something that she always wanted to express. For example, this sculpture here called Shalom, with a family group inside it, is at the Amadown Centre for Peace and Reconciliation near Bath. And during that time when she was developing the human figure, she also went back to looking at her own heritage. She started to study Talmud, and in her sculptures, she wanted to show the characters of some of the biblical figures that we know. So on the left is Abraham and Isaac, and on the right is Moses. And this theme, using the human figure, was ever present in the works that were commissioned by churches and cathedrals for that message of understanding between faiths. This sculpture here, Shalva, is at a small church, and the name is just going out of my head, in Bloomsbury. It's called All Souls Church. This sculpture here, Family Group, again with the motive of the family, is at Friend's House in Euston to honour Bertha Bracey, who was a Quaker who rescued many Jewish children. And this sculpture here at St Ethelburga's Church in the city express that importance of reconciliation, peace and understanding. She was always happy when she was working in her studio. It was a ramshackle old garage with no heating, but this was her space where she was free. She called this space her heaven, and she said in another press interview, "Some people have it when they die. I have it now." For my mother, her sculpture enabled her to express her past, but more importantly, it enabled her to use it as a medium to spread a broader message, how we must remember and learn from the past. She would be horrified to know today that there are refugees, just as she once was, fleeing war and persecution, sitting in camps in Europe. And she would hope that her story and her sculpture could be used positively to create better understanding.
Yeah, I know I have to help me, and if I help others, it somehow comes back to me. I had this idea always in concentration camp. To survive is not only to snatch a little more bread, it's to help others, and you get stronger through it. That kept me going. I try to help really other people.
I think she'd be gratified to know that her work is still being viewed. And I'm pleased to say that this week, 3 sculptures of hers were placed outside in the forecourt of the Royal Society of Sculptors as part of a project on pioneering women, and also to mark last week's International Women's Week. And as a fellow of the society, I think she'd be very proud and happy that the work is there and that I'm continuing to tell her story. So let me just leave you with a few more of her words, but this time words in writing, which is quite rare for her. She says, "If my sculptural forms move in whatever direction, I doubt whether my words will. Don't talk sculpture, sculpt. Painter, paint. But just as a guide, let us say that an artist is a mediator, a channel through which motivations of the past, the present, anxieties and hopes for the future are subconsciously transmitted into forms and lines. These intermingle together from a clouded past through a teething present to a mature future." And the final image, again, is of her sculpture, because I don't think she'd want necessarily to be remembered for her words. She'd want to be remembered for her sculpture. And this is the cover of the sculpture book that was created in 2014, where Monica has written the foreword. And it summarizes the themes that I have presented to you: the memory of the Holocaust, the promotion of understanding between faiths, and her hopes for a positive future. But I'd be very interested to hear from you what else you see in her work. And with that, I think I better stop, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Anita. Wonderful and hugely moving, as it cannot fail to be. I cannot believe that there are no questions. We had one very nice compliment, which I will read out to you.
Stunned into silence.
Absolutely. Well, it's hard not to feel kind of somehow inhibited when you hear her story, but do please come forward with your questions and any comments you may have. From somebody called Frida, great admiration to Anita for telling Naomi's amazing story. So hard for her. And she's presented the lecture so beautifully. Absolutely. Hear, hear.
Can I answer that? I know it's not a question, but I will answer it. It's not hard at all. I do it with enormous pride. Yeah, I don't find it hard. I find it hard when I'm a bit nervous beforehand and I can't kind of settle down, but I do. I I'm very motivated to tell the story. I think it's really important. It's something that my mother told me she wanted me to do when I was 9 years old. The harder part is actually talking about her sculpture, because I feel a bit of a fraud. Monica's better at talking about sculpture than I am. But I suppose as her daughter, I have a right to at least tell you what I see in it. But I would really love to hear your thoughts about her sculpture and what themes you see.
Well, look, please, yes, please. Here we are, hold on. All right, Alex Clark. Well, actually, again, it's mostly profound thank you. She seems like a woman sculpting her future as well as, hold on, as well as speaking to her past. That's a lovely way of putting it, isn't it? Really beautiful.
I'll have to write that down.
Yes, exactly. Sculpting her future as well as speaking to the past. That's brilliantly put. I'm deeply moved and in awe. Thank you for speaking of her. And from Lisa, very beautiful work, amazing tributes to such hardship and hope for peace and reconciliation. Thank you for sharing. Daria, I have a question. Do you want, Susan, can Daria unmute herself, or do you have to do it for her? I think probably given the relatively small numbers, in fact, we've got a bit of time.
Let me just, here we are. I was just looking for you, Daria, but you just put your camera on, so that's great. If I can ask you to unmute.
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Hello, hi.
Hi, is it working? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Anita, for this very beautiful and incredibly dignified presentation of your mother's work and history. I also found it very moving. And I wanted to ask you about your feelings as a child. You described your interpretation of the sculpture dedicated to the 6 million, the two hands in supplication as you saw it with the barbed wire around. And it's an extraordinary thought to imagine this just being an object amongst other objects in the house, you know, sitting maybe next to the lamp and coffee mug, or, you know, next to the other objects. And I was thinking about a anecdotal study described to me by a psychotherapist who works in trauma at the Tavistock Clinic. I don't know what source the study is, so I can't cite it. But she told me that for descendants of Holocaust survivors, there can be a sense that descendants are more vulnerable to trauma and depression themselves when their parents or grandparents have not processed their experiences or have not been able to, which of course is often and usually the case, but that when parents or grandparents do somehow manage to process their experiences, that this can give descendants, on the contrary, more resilience. And I'm struck by the ways that your mother managed to, in some way, process her experience through her artwork. So I suppose my question is for you, as the second generation, and I myself am in the third, and as you know, I'm interested in this transgenerational relationship. Do you feel that her artwork somehow made this history more approachable for you? And in what other ways has your encounter with her artwork throughout your life changed? It's a big question, I suppose.
Well, firstly, I can say that I never felt traumatized. Not when she told me her story, even at the age of 9. She presented a very calm person, and I think she always was. So, and I wouldn't like to speak for others. I know that there are some who experience trauma, and it's not always because their parents didn't speak. Sometimes it's because their parents spoke too much about it. I don't think one can generalize, but I also know, in fact, most of the people I know did not experience trauma. They feel, as I do, quite strong by hearing the stories, by by understanding how their parents survived and feeling great pride. So I think we have to be, I know that there are studies about trauma, and I'm not suggesting that there isn't trauma in some, but it's not something that is part of my experience. And it's not part of the experience that I know. It is very interesting, and of course everybody reacts very differently. I often wonder whether my mother's ability to deal with it is part of her just her personality as well, and those are things that we can't really unpick, can we? So yes, it could be that through her sculpture, I'm sure it helped her, and but I think there were other things that helped her. She survived with her sister the whole time they were together. Now that was luck. And I do think that luck plays a part. She also, some of her family survived. There are some survivors that lost everybody. My mother-in-law lost everybody. So I think everybody reacts differently, and it may be a culmination of all those different things made my mum able to cope, and therefore for me also. But as I said, I think that the experience is so different across the board.
Thank you.
I wonder if I might come in there as an art historian, taking a slightly more detached sort of view. I mean, this whole relationship between trauma and creativity, of course, is a hugely complex and fascinating one. And I think no artist would claim that art is a total catharsis of dark experience, but nevertheless, it is a very powerful means of at least somehow, not even working through, that sounds too glib, but of grappling with, of actually somehow coming to terms with, and indeed finding a positive way of actually coming out the other end. So I think, you know, there are big questions there. Got lots of lovely compliments, but no questions as such. I wonder, Anita, if I can move things on in a slightly different direction. Clearly, interfaith dialogue was terribly important to her, particularly in later decades. She comes from an Orthodox family, presumably, you know, imbued sort of at home with all the Jewish ritual. How did she feel as a Jew in the wake of the Holocaust? Because yeah, you'd say she returned to Talmud study, but that was also again later. And I just wondered to what extent her experiences actually shook her faith. I mean, this is again, big question, but I think really important.
Yeah,
one.
no, that's important. No, I mean, you know, obviously I could spend hours telling her story, but as a young girl, she was a little bit of a rebel. She joined Hashomer Hatzair, the left-wing Zionist group that her family were opposed to. She always had a dream of going to Israel. She believed in, you know, left-wing rules, and she didn't, although she was very, very, what's the word? You know, she was a rebel. She didn't really believe in the ritual, but she was also a very good daughter, and therefore didn't want to rock the boat. But I think she told me that she always knew that she probably wouldn't remain religious. I think probably what happened in the Holocaust further pushed her away from religion, but I think she probably wouldn't have been religious anyway. That's what she told me. But I can tell you that she always told me that she felt that despite the fact that she didn't have a kosher home and that she didn't follow rituals, I mean, we did always light candles on Friday night, and she felt religious. And she would describe herself as religious, but not by Orthodox terms. But she would also say, when I asked her if she believed in God, she said, well, I don't know whether I believe in God, but if I do, I'm very, very angry with him. She said him as well. But so I don't know whether that answers your question. Her, you know, so she She was a left-wing Zionist Jew, even in her younger days. She was not religious, but she loved religion. And I remember sometimes when we were in Israel and we would be near Mea Sharim and we would see somebody with a white beard and wearing a long white cloak, and she would, almost with tears in her eyes, remember Mukacheva. So she was very fond of those memories. And it was later that she started to study the Talmud, and she found that very interesting, and it helped her sculpture. But she wasn't religious in the traditional sense, only in, I would say, a more spiritual sense.
I think that comes through, doesn't it? Absolutely. There's an additional kind of complicating factor, and I just wonder whether I could just briefly ask you about that, because of course there's the whole big, again, thorny question of the church's complicity in the Holocaust, its failure to act and so on and so forth. And I wonder if that's something she ever talked about that might make the fact that she worked with and for the church more problematic.
I'm sure that was a driving force. I'm sure that there is a reason why she was working with the churches, and it was because of that. But she never really talked about in those negative terms. It was always about repairing that relationship.
Right.
But I'm sure that was a driving force, because the fact is that she didn't work to promote understanding with other faiths, because I think she saw the major issue of anti-Semitism, she felt had come from the churches, unfortunately.
Indeed, indeed. A more biographical question here from Jacqueline. May I ask why your mother decided to leave Israel?
Oh, it was with great reluctance, and something that she often fought with my dad about, because when she met him, she had left Israel to visit her sister Malchi, who she had survived concentration camp with, and Malchi and her husband were living in Tangier, so she boarded a boat from Haifa, not thinking that she was wanting to leave Israel, and on that boat a young man carried her luggage and they became friends. She carried on to Tangier. She then met him a few times in Europe. She went back to Israel. She was a bit of a lost soul at that point. She had been married and that had ended. So the main reason she went to London was because of my father. She never thought that she would stay in London. She always wanted to return to Israel. He had said he wanted to do that, but it never happened.
But you kept in touch, didn't you? She paid many visits, am I right?
Oh yes, so they went once or twice a year, and I think it always bothered her, but she loved London as well.
And perhaps it's time to start rounding up. There's a question here from, oh, sorry, I can only see the first bits of people's names, but I'm interested if Naomi knew about Asian sculpture, the sculptural tradition, as a theme of protection is present in Jain and Buddhist sculpture. That's an interesting question. And Naomi's sculptures remind me of this to some extent.
Right, and I'm really sorry, but I don't know the answer. I could probably, you know, in her studio, she's got a whole load of these old books, and those must be the main books that she refers to. She's certainly got loads of art books as well. So it may well be that she was familiar with that work, but I don't know. She didn't really talk to me about that.
I mean, I wonder, for example, on the back of that, whether she frequented the British Museum at all, or indeed the V&A.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yes, so okay, in a way the answer may be there as well, indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. I'm just scrolling down or seeing if there are any other questions. Your last chance. As I say, lots of complimentary comments rather than questions. So just to give you a few more minutes. Just on the question of sort of affinities and possibly sculptural influences, you mentioned Henry Moore and Hepworth, that kind of what's called biomorphic abstraction. You know, it's never totally abstract, is it? There's always the hint of the human figure there. Were there any other names that she tended to mention as people, artists she admired?
Those were the two that I know she admired. I think there was Arp as well.
Yeah.
And certainly when you look at Arp's work, there's a lot of the kind of spaces within and without that you see in her work. But it was really Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth that particularly Barbara Hepworth. Maybe because she was a woman,
Yeah.
although she probably would say no to that, but I think there's something in it, you know. I think she was almost proud that, because what's interesting is when I was contacted by the Royal Society of Sculptors to ask if they could have these 3 sculptures outside their premises, they told me that they had gone into the archives because they wanted to see who the pioneering women of sculpture were, and that there were only, in the time that my mum was sculpting, I think they said there were only 3 women sculptors who were fellows of the Royal Society.
It is extraordinary,
and
isn't it?
being a female sculptor was just not known and not really regarded, and that was surprising to me as well. So I do think that must have had an impact when she saw Barbara Hepworth's work, because Barbara Hepworth was the pioneer of women's sculptures in many ways.
There were, I think, probably a surprising number, but they didn't make it to the Royal Society of Sculptors. It's a whole other big...
Or they just didn't speak up because they didn't feel they were good enough. Who knows?
I mean, sculpture's always been seen as a quintessentially sort of masculine activity that required brawn and strength, which clearly wasn't necessarily the case indeed. Perhaps we should just end with a comment from Chrissy. Thank you so much for sharing the story of your amazing journey and survival, and also, of course, her work. I think you must be so proud. And then she ends by saying her recognition as a pioneering woman is wonderful, and this is beyond honoured in the week of the International Women's Week. Absolutely. And indeed, I mean, I think there's a kind of irony in the fact that she has entered the ranks, if you like, of the Royal Society. It used to be called the Royal Society of British Sculptors, no less. So
right.
Yes, right. Indeed, lovely. I think that's a lovely note on which to end. Actually, let me just double check if there's anything else. Somebody just mentioned Brancusi ? Frida, is that an sculptor she ever mentioned?
It's not a sculpture, an artist that she mentioned, but my sister-in-law, Isabel, who is involved in the art world as a picture restorer, she gave a talk about my mum once and looked more at the context of the time that my mum was working, and she mentioned Brancusi as well. Yeah.
Indeed, lovely. Well, I think it's probably time to round up. I'd like to just conclude the proceedings by just mentioning 2 events that may be of interest to people listening in today. One is that a colleague of mine called Marilyn Green, who's a very experienced walking guide, in the times of COVID, she has to go virtual, but on the 30th of this month, 30th of March at 11 o'clock in the morning, she's doing a virtual walking tour called Sanctuary in the City. You get the reference there, and it will actually be embracing not only Naomi's work, but a whole range of artists of refugee and immigrant origin. But she will be looking in some detail, both, well, at the you didn't mention both works, did you? But there are 2 works, both in different churches in the city, one of which we had the pleasure of seeing today. So do, if you're interested, log on to the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website, go to what's on and you'll see it there. It's free of charge. You simply have to register. And the other thing, which is addressing this much bigger subject of artists, non-Christian, indeed mostly Jewish artists, who ended up, many of them from refugee backgrounds, who ended up working for the church in this country and or working with Christian themes, will be the topic of a one-day online conference or symposium, if you like, on the 16th of June, which Insiders Outsiders is organising in collaboration with an organisation. I don't know, Anita, whether you've come across them, called Art and Christianity. It used to be called ACE, Art and Christianity.
Yes, I have heard about
and
that.
Laura Moffat, I have a feeling Laura might be listening in. I think I glimpsed her name somewhere. And also St John's Waterloo, which is the church just near Waterloo Station, which happens to have 2 major murals by Hans Feibusch, a German Jewish refugee artist who ended up producing more murals for the Church of England, believe it or not, than any other artist in its history. Quite amazing and very, very intriguing. So it's on the 16th of June. And again, details are on the Insiders Outsiders website, free of charge. If you're interested, do pursue that. So it only remains for me to thank all of you for being here and asking such interesting questions and all your appreciative comments. And Anita, once again, thank you very, very much. And I think there will be more to come. I know Anita's looking at you for homes, places to sort of find a good home for your mother's work now that she's no longer with us. So I wish you luck with that, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for listening.
Lots of virtual claps. Okay, many thanks. Be well, everybody. Good night. Not good night, good afternoon.